previous video, I looked at how TA conceptualizes mind games and drama. For instance, Stephen Cartman's drama triangle, where the players switch between the dramatic roles of victim, persecutor, and rescuer. And Eric Berne's games formula, where both parties can be seen as using the other one to fulfill some need. TA writers sometimes suggest that the thing to do when it comes to mind games is to figure out the other person's needs and deprive them of those needs. The fact is, we can't always determine what other people's underlying needs are. If someone's throwing a load of insults your way, how do you determine whether they sincerely believe the insults, or whether they know the insults aren't true and they're just trying to provoke you? People can't even determine their own needs sometimes, because they're acting on needs outside their own awareness. I think we can spend way too much time trying to figure other people out, when a much more productive strategy is to try and figure ourselves out. If we can identify what it is in ourselves that draws us into games, we don't need to know the underlying motives of the other person at all. The needs of the game's target are referred to in TA as gimmicks. The word gimmick can sound like a judgment, but while some gimmicks might be based on vanities or personal illusions we haven't quite got to grips with yet, gimmicks can also be based on rules that are generally very positive and productive within certain populations. For instance, rules like trust people work fine in a population of reciprocators, but not in a population of parasites. Here's an example of a gimmick in action in a game Eric Berne called Schlemiel. A is a guest at B's party. A spills a drink on B's dress. B is angry, but keeps it together. A apologizes. B makes a statement of forgiveness. A continues to spill things, drop things, and break things, all of which he apologizes for, and all of which B makes a show of forgiving, on the social level. But what B actually feels is far from forgiveness. B knows his accidents are totally deliberate, and A even knows she knows. So if they both know the accidents are deliberate, why would B go along with this pretense? Because of B's gimmick. B has some need about being reasonable. It could come in many different strains. It might be the broad principle, I must be reasonable, or it might be a more subtle variation, I must appear reasonable. It might be a conditional rule, like, I must appear reasonable if the other person appears reasonable. One particularly potent variation is this one. I will appear reasonable to show you I'm better than you. B's no longer merely keeping her own behaviour in check here. She's now out to prove something against A. The more damage A does, the more chances B gets to show she's superior. If we take another look at Berne's game of why don't you yes but, mentioned in the last video, where A states some problem, B offers a string of solutions, but A finds a flaw in each one of B's ideas, we can see similar variations are possible. Here, B has some need about being helpful. It might be the broad principle, I must be helpful, or I must appear helpful, or other such variations. But something that will really pull B in is this one. I can make you feel grateful for helping you. This is potentially a very strong hook, because it really locks into the other person, who in turn can take the laid-back psychological stance of, go on then. Sometimes we can be so engulfed in a need that we don't realise it's us that starts the games. We can think we're responding to games when we're actually instigating them. B remarks that A looks a little subdued. A says she's feeling a little down about something, but she's okay. B, with his overweening desire to help, offers a string of suggestions of things they might do to lift A's spirits. A rejects each one. After a while, B thinks, A's just playing why don't you yes but. She just wants attention, and sucker that I am, there I go trying to help her. But A hasn't been playing why don't you yes but. A's taking responsibility for her own feelings, and requires absolutely nothing from B. It's B who started the game with his own need for gratitude, and uses the game to collect payoff feelings of unappreciated martyrdom. If we find ourselves playing a particular game or games, we can begin to identify our needs with some honest introspection. What are we really after in the game? What's our imagined ideal outcome? Are we seeking to gain something? Are we seeking to avoid something? Are we seeking to confirm some kind of status or image? What do we ultimately want to see happen to the other player? Answers to these will give us big clues to our gimmick. Some gimmicks have a less than obvious connection to the games they appeal to. The why don't you yes but game is ostensibly about help, but it can work on someone who's not that bothered about helping at all. For instance, someone who feels socially ill at ease and uses the streams of suggestions to fend off awkward silences. When we become aware of the precise nature of our gimmick in a particular game, we have a greater chance of unhooking from that game. Once we have an idea about what our gimmicks are, we can think our way out by questioning the flawed assumptions they contain, or we can act our way out, act against the need, and so take control of it, rather than have it controlled by others. Gimmicks can come in the form of rules or imperatives like the ones already mentioned. The universal style of these rules is a clue to the problems they tend to set up. Should we always be that particular thing? If it's our goal to hold ourselves to expectations like this, not only will we constantly disappoint ourselves, but chances are people will eventually come along who take advantage of these unrealistic self-expectations and use them against us in the games they play. If we find that messages like these are driving us, we can evaluate how realistic they are. Depending on the characteristic we're looking at, we might decide to change it in this way, or like this. Sometimes we carry around ideas like, I must be reasonable, not realizing that the definition we're using for that word is skewed. If we dig a little deeper into what we're using the word reasonable to mean, we might find messages like this. I must not show anger. I must avoid uncomfortable scenes. I've got a nice person image I must maintain. But what does it really mean to be reasonable? If we look at the definition of reasonable, we see things like this: acting in accordance with reason, having sound judgment. Is it showing sound judgment to allow someone to continue deliberately spilling things, dropping things and breaking things while pretending not to care? I'd say not. If you know someone's doing that stuff on purpose, it's reasonable to make it clear you know what they're doing and eject them. If you're unsure whether or not they were doing it on purpose, you might be willing to overlook a single accident. But with continued damage, it's reasonable to ask them to pay for the damage. If they decline to pay, then it's reasonable to ask them to leave. If someone's genuinely clumsy in life, that's their own adult responsibility, and they can deal with it in a variety of ways. They can work at it and become less clumsy, or take preventative measures to avoid accident-prone situations, or they can take the consequences of their clumsiness and pay for damages. But to expect others to just put up with it, and all the hassle and expense it creates for them, is unreasonable. So sometimes getting rid of faulty, gamey versions of words like this and substituting actual definitions can block out games. Helpful is another word that can be rife with skewed, gamey definitions. For years, A has complained to B that he's not a good friend to her. She complains when he invites her along to places or activities she doesn't like. He should know she doesn't like them. She then complains when he doesn't invite her to those things. Now she feels left out. She complains when B asks her about things in her life she doesn't want to talk about. She later decides she does want to talk about those things, and complains when B doesn't ask her about them, all the time reminding him that a real friend wouldn't do these things. B's fighting a losing battle here. In A's company, he's no longer the natural, authentic individual everyone else in his life knows him to be. He's now acting out a role rather than being a person. He hopes to be the good friend. It's something he can never be, because the definition of good friend here is telepathic. B can exit the game by taking back ownership of the rules, rejecting the bogus, shifting expectations imposed by A about what makes a good friend, and defining for himself what's acceptable behaviour in a friend. If we know what behaviour our gimmicks bring out in us, we can just choose not to behave that way. If your need for harmony leads you to keep the peace in your family, try not keeping the peace. Let people sort out their own differences. After all, if they don't learn the skills to deal with each other, what will they do when you're not around? If your need for approval means you never say no when people ask you for favours, say no to the next favour asked of you. Just see what happens. See how it feels going into that new territory. Observe all the things that invite you back into the game, guilty or angry thoughts and rationalizations that pop into your head to justify the game, maybe just this once. Increased provocation from the game players to draw you back in to meet their needs. Notice all of that and still refuse to get involved. Experience that disharmony, that disapproval, and realise that while those things might feel uncomfortable, they're not in fact unbearable. There might even be a sense of liberation from years of slavery to that need. We don't have to figure game players out to extract ourselves from time-consuming mind games. With a little introspection, we can figure out our own needs. With a little reasoning, we can then question the premises of those needs. And with a little curiosity, we can see what it's like to try something different.